Have you ever noticed that a lot of the books people love the most also get the least amount of respect? Well, I realized this when I made the entirely financially sound decision to study creative writing in college. And while I had a wonderful experience and amazing professors, I also realized that a lot of the books I loved the most, YA and fantasy, were not viewed as serious literature by my mentors. I was told that books like the Percy Jackson series and the Simon Snow trilogy were formulaic, immature, and one-dimensional, even though books like these were what made me and basically everyone else in my program love reading in the first place. Not just that, the fantasy and YA I read as a teenager taught me that stories can be powerful. They can make people feel intensely, and even change the way people think. And yet, these books are often dismissed as pop fiction or chick lit, which not only reeks of misogyny, it's incredibly ironic, because many of the authors we view as great today, Shakespeare and Zora Neale Hurston, just to name a few, were the pop fiction and chick lit authors of their day, and they often received the same disrespect from the establishment that YA and fantasy authors do today. This is not to say that YA and fantasy are genres without problems. They can perpetuate damaging stereotypes, and sometimes seem more focused on generating profit than producing a good story. But these critiques are for another video. Today I want to talk about the epic beauty that is the novel Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, and to analyze it the way my literature professors taught me to analyze great books. Because if this book ain't literature, I don't know what is. I want to start with a content warning. Six of Crows goes to some dark places. There are depictions of drug use, addiction, graphic violence, child abuse, sexual abuse, and human trafficking. I'm not going to read any graphic passages out loud, but they will be referenced. Also, this is not an analysis of the Shadow and Bone TV series or the depiction of the Crows characters therein, but I am going to use clips from the TV show because it makes things more visually interesting and because I'm deeply in love with every single one of the actors. Though I'm making this video right before Season 2 drops, so there aren't going to be any Season 2 clips. God, I can't wait for Season 2. Also, there's going to be spoilers for Six of Crows the book, and I'm assuming both seasons of the TV show. As most of you know, Six of Crows is a story about a group of outcasts living in Ketterdam, which is basically a fictionalized Amsterdam in the world of the Grishaverse, which is a fictional universe created by Leigh Bardugo in which certain people, the Grisha, can manipulate the world around them in magical ways. Our outcasts are brought together because they've been hired to break into the Ice Court, the most secure stronghold in the world, to rescue the scientist Bo-Yul Bayer, who has developed a drug that can dramatically heighten Grisha ability at the expense that it is extremely addictive and eventually kills them. Some people find the first chapter of the book unnecessary or at least weirdly disconnected from the rest of the story, but I actually view it as a useful framing device through which to view the rest of the book. So while I'm not going to spend a lot of time on summarizing because this video is mostly for people who have read the book already, I am going to linger on this chapter for a minute. The first chapter is told through the perspective of Joost, a member of the Stadwatch, which is the Ketterdam police force. Joost has been hired to provide extra security to a wealthy mercher, which is just the Grishaverse word for merchant. When we meet him, Joost is scrambling to come up with a compliment to give to Anya, a Grisha who is indentured to the merchant and who Joost has a big fat crush on. Just based on Joost's internal monologue, we learn a couple important things about the world of the story. The Ketterdam police force is focused on protecting the wealthiest citizens of the city, even though the merchant Joost is protecting already has a private security force and more than enough resources to keep himself and his family safe. And as Joost points out, most of the crime happens in a different part of the city altogether. The city clearly cares more about protecting the rich than the poor, revealing the institutional inequality that exists in Ketterdam. Next, we learn that the merchant, in cooperation with the rest of Ketterdam's merchant council, has been experimenting on his Grisha with Jerdaparum, the drug that enhances their abilities before eventually killing them. Joost is brought into the boathouse where Anya is being held in a cell and watches as she is forced to take the drug. This is a moment of conflict for Joost. He wants to defend Anya, but ultimately he just stands and watches as she is experimented on. This is because he's outnumbered. He doesn't think he can actually help her even if he tries. But he also admits to himself that part of the reason he doesn't help is because he wants to keep his job. One of the other merchants asks Hode, the merchant who employs Joost and Anya, whether he's sure it's safe to give Anya the drug after what happened to the last Grisha they gave it to. And Hode assures him that Anya has a sweet disposition and is thus unlikely to be dangerous. Indeed, based on what we've seen of Anya so far, she does seem to be sweet and passive. But when she takes the Jerdaparum, her justice is swift and brutal. When the chapter ends, Anya has gained the upper hand and put all the soldiers, including Juiced, into a trance. She's also instructed Hode to pick up the knife. As we learn later, she was not suggesting they carve pumpkins together. She forces Hode to cut off his own thumb, which is what he was about to have done to the little boy they were using in the experiment. And she leaves all the soldiers in that waiting trance. She probably didn't realize that by doing so she was sentencing them to death, but you also get the sense she doesn't really care. Not gonna lie, I'm still rooting for her. So why does this chapter matter? When you're doing a literary analysis, what you're really doing is looking for meanings beyond the obvious. To put it another way,
onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers.
And so do books. When in doubt, reference Shrek. When searching for these hidden layers of meaning, it's often useful to look for hints the author might have left to indicate that a word or passage is more than it seems. In Six of Crows, these hints often take the form of card game references. Even the title is a reference to a playing card. And in this chapter, there are like a bazillion other hints that playing cards are going to be important in this book. So before I started rereading Six of Crows, I did some research on the histories and meanings behind tarot and other playing cards to see if they could shed some light on the hidden meanings in the story. And saints did I go down a rabbit hole. Let's start with a brief history of playing cards, which I mostly got from an Atlantic magazine article and from historicmysteries.com, which I'll give full citations for in the bio of this video along with all my other references. So the playing cards we are familiar with today have unclear origins, but they seem to have originated in either India or China and made their way to Europe through trade routes during the 1300s. The church was not too fond of these little paper amusements, considering them to be sources of depravity because of their connection to gambling and flirtation. They even dubbed playing cards the devil's picture book. The four suits, which we know today as hearts, spades, clubs, and diamonds, varied by region and throughout history, as did the designs of the cards. Often, card design was dictated by the local nobles and elites. The elaborate yet uniform card backs evolved to make the cards more resilient to wear and tear, and to prevent distinguishing marks from being left on them, which made them better gambling tools. What does any of this have to do with the first chapter of Six of Crows? I'm so glad you asked. The King of Hearts is a unique card in that he is the only king without a mustache. And, due to a printing error back in ye olden days, he also appears to be stabbing himself. And as all we true fans know, despite his desire for one, Juice does not have a mustache. He is also killed by the girl he loves, a fate akin to being stabbed in the heart. Coincidence? Maybe. But either way, it makes for an interesting metaphor. If Juice is meant to represent the King of Hearts, what does that tell us? He is not a playing card, he is clearly a person. But we often treat people in pretty two-dimensional ways, don't we? We assign them labels, we put them in boxes, we believe in stereotypes, sometimes without even meaning to. Juice is a soldier, so we'd expect him to be fierce and strong, a protector of the people of Ketterdam. But as we learn pretty quickly, Juiced is young and sensitive, not at all fierce, and even a bit of a coward. It's also very clear that the Stadwatch is more focused on protecting Ketterdam's elite than acting as the defender of the people. Anya, too, doesn't fit the role we would expect of her. She is a servant, a healer, and a young woman. All of these things imply that she should be docile and non-violent, but we see that obviously isn't the case when she takes her revenge on Hode and the soldiers. So the moral of this chapter is that roles, titles, and stereotypes can all be misleading, and just in case we didn't get the message, the whole first page of the book is about the moon and how it's hanging sickly and not quite right in the sky. Guess what the meaning of the reversed moon is in the tarot? Delusion, obfuscation, the idea that we may not be seeing things clearly. I feel I should make a quick note here about authorial intent. Did Leigh Bardugo intentionally give Juiced traits similar to the King of Hearts and invoke the moon in reference to the tarot? I don't actually know. But noticing these things made me realize that Six of Crows is essentially a story about identities, the ones we build for ourselves and project onto others, and the ways power shapes how we view one another. So while Six of Crows could be analyzed from many different angles, for the purposes of this video, I'm going to view it through the metaphor of the playing cards. What identities do these characters assume? And what lies behind the two-dimensional masks they show the world? Kaz sees past the stereotypes and myths of others better than any other character in the book, and it makes him really good at manipulating people. This man is never not playing 5D chess. We get our first example of, I guess you can call them his people skills? In Chapter 2, when he outsmarts a rival gang leader, Giles of the Black Tips. Giles presents himself as a tough and seasoned crime boss, but But Kaz sees right past this disguise. He knows that Giles' love for his girlfriend is going to outweigh his desire to beat the dregs. She lives at 19 Burr Strat, Kaz said in his gravelly rasp. 3 floors up, geraniums in the window boxes. There are 2 dregs waiting outside her door right now, and if I don't walk out of here whole and feeling righteous, they will set that place alight from floor to rooftop. Needless to say, this works pretty effectively. We see Kaz use his knowledge of people's true natures again and again throughout the book, particularly when it comes to identifying the weaknesses of the Ice Court, a supposedly impenetrable fortress. He figures out the best way to sneak into the court by identifying a psychological flaw in the security system. That was the beauty of all these fail-safes and layers of security. The guards always thought they could rely on someone else to catch a mistake or fix a problem. Laziness wasn't as reliable as greed, but it still made a fine lever. And they were talking about prisoners, chained, surrounded on all sides, and about to be dumped in cells. Harmless. Leigh Bardugo has to have robbed at least one bank, right? Otherwise all this criminal mastermindery is going to waste. Kaz was able to bring his crew together in the first place because of his ability to see past their exteriors. He recognized that Inej had the potential to be a dangerous fighter, even when she was a scared girl trapped in a brothel. He also saw through Matthias's Druskella mask and realized that his love for Nina would overcome his prejudice against Grisha, even before Matthias knew it himself. And he's unfazed when he learns that Wylan can't read, because he recognizes this doesn't actually say anything about Wylan's intelligence. Neither stereotype, nor reputation, nor personal delusion seems to cloud his judgment. Not only is Kaz scarily good at seeing through to other people's true natures, he is also extremely skilled at hiding his own. In an interview for the website Disability and Kidlit, Leigh Bardugo talked about how, even after finishing the first draft of the book, she didn't feel like she knew Kaz that well. The myth he builds around himself, his ruthlessness, mysteriousness, and lack of vulnerability, is so strong that at first, even the author couldn't see through it. But as we quickly learn, Kaz knows that the persona he projects is just that, a myth. He recognizes that he has vulnerabilities. He hates it, but he recognizes it. But the line marking where Kaz ends and Dirty Hands begins is unclear both to the reader and to Kaz himself, which we see for the first time in the conversation between him and Inej after the confrontation with the Blacktips. He spends the whole scene trying to convince Inej that he is a bad person with no moral compass who will do whatever it takes to get what he wants. In fact, they have some version of this conversation multiple times throughout the book. Inej trying to get Kaz to admit he has a conscience, and Kaz vehemently denying it. But in all those conversations, it becomes increasingly clear that Kaz is super in love with Inej, proving that he does in fact value something other than money and revenge. Also, if he's really such a cold person, why doesn't he just try and convince Inej he's a good person? That would actually work more in his favor, because he needs Inej's skills, and if he pisses her off too much, she is more than capable of stabbing him in the balls and going off to do her own thing. But no, instead he tells her over and over again that he is an unredeemable monster. Is it to push her away because of his fear of intimacy? To see if she'll stay with him even when faced with his worst self? Maybe to protect her from developing feelings for him? Whatever the reason, this is not the behavior of someone who doesn't care what anyone else thinks. I found a really interesting thesis online about Six of Crows by a student named Catherine Esposito, and she points out how Kaz's cane is a metaphor for how he's always relied on his friends and allies to get him through. The cane has the head of a crow. Kaz refers to his allies as the crows. Furthermore, when Kaz is on the verge of a panic attack in the Ice Court, he tries to steady himself with thoughts of his revenge. But the thing that actually keeps him from losing control is thinking about Inej and his crew, how he got them into this situation, and how they're relying on him to get them out. We also learn towards the end of the book that when they were going undercover in the Ice Court, Kaz would not let Nina remove the R tattooed on his bicep, which stands for Rietveld, his family name. This indicates that some small part of Kaz never wanted to become the monstrous myth he was building. But we can also understand why Kaz came up with this myth in the first place. When they are locked in the prison at the Ice Court, a fellow prisoner tries to beat Kaz up because Kaz is visibly disabled. Giles, Per Haskell, and Pekka Rollins all try to use his youth and inexperience against him, and Pekka Rollins succeeds, at least at first. In Ketterdam and in the world at large, Kaz has learned that people will use your weaknesses against you, so it's best to make them think you don't have any. In addition, Kaz's unwavering confidence in himself and his crew is something that the rest of the Crows rely on. They need to believe that they are legendary masters of their craft, not a band of desperate, frightened kids. Kaz's awareness of the mythology he has built around himself is also the main thing that separates him from Jan van Eyck. Six of Crows' main villain. When Van Eyck and Kaz first meet, we already know that Kaz has a bone to pick with the Murchers of Ketterdam. In Chapter 2, Inej describes how Kaz purposefully dresses like them in order to point out that he doesn't see much of a difference between thieves and merchants. "I'm a businessman," he'd told her. "No more, no less." "You're a thief, Kaz." "Isn't that what I just said?" He's like an evil Bernie Sanders. When Van Eyck hires Kaz to break into the ice court, they have this exchange where Kaz accuses Van Eyck of cheating people out of their money just as much as he does, and points out that 1 in 5 merchant ships are taken by pirates or sink. So how can Van Eyck claim he is any less violent and depraved than Kaz? At the end of the book, when Van Eyck reveals he intends to cheat the Crows out of the money he owes them, and also kill them, Kaz asks him how he can reconcile his faith in Gazen, the god of commerce, with the breaking of a contract. This is Van Eyck's response. "What have you given to the world, Mr. Brecker? Have you created wealth, prosperity? No. You take from honest men and women and serve only yourself. Gazen shows his favor to those who are deserving, to those who build cities, not the rats who eat away at their foundations." Van Eyck doesn't just pretend to be a devout and upstanding merchant. He actually believes he is one. He is able to justify to himself every atrocity he commits. When Inej points out that his plan to unleash Jertaparam on the world will lead to the enslavement of all Grisha, he basically says that bad shit's gonna happen anyway, so why not profit off of it? This is terrifying because excuses like these are exactly what tyrants and oppressors in our world use every day to justify their actions. Kaz and Van Eyck are both violent, manipulative, and ruthless, but the difference is that Kaz knows what he is, and saves his worst brutality for powerful bullies, whereas Van Eyck has deluded himself into believing he's the good guy, and that no matter what he does, even if he kills his own son, he will always be the good guy. So I think the main lesson Kaz's character teaches us is to be wary of the mythologies and stereotypes that define people, because they're incomplete and can lead us to serious misjudgments. At the same time, you can use the oversimplified way people view you to your advantage, as long as you don't fall for your own con and start thinking you are the persona you project. To put it another way, if you want to play the game well, remember, people are more than cards. When we first meet Inej, she is struggling to reconcile her conscience and her faith with her violent life as Kaz Brecker's wraith. On the one hand, she knows her only alternative was a nightmarish existence at the menagerie, the brothel she was sold to at age 15. On the other hand, she bought her freedom with the blood of others, and at this point, she doesn't really have to stay with the dregs anymore. She's a master of stealth and knives, so if she wants to leave, no one can really stop her. So why is she still in Ketterdam? Partially because she doesn't want to leave Kaz vulnerable. He relies on her, and if she left, he would be out a lot of money. But also because she doesn't know where else to go. She is constantly bringing up this Subi proverb, "The heart is an arrow, it demands aim to land true." She doesn't know what to put her heart into, what kind of life she can build after everything she's been through and the dark things she's done to survive, how she can heal the wounds that still haunt her. In her thesis, Esposito points out that Inej's trauma is different from Kaz's, in that Kaz is a relatively privileged person in the Grishaverse society who got unlucky, whereas Inej was targeted because she is part of an oppressed group. And she's right. The Suli aren't given any rights by the Ravkan government, despite having been there for longer than the word Ravka. Inej's family was forced to live on the outskirts of society, and thus the slavers that took her knew her family wouldn't have the resources to come looking for her, and that the government wouldn't help them. Kaz builds his myth on purpose, and helps Inej build one of her own. But before she became the Wraith, she was forced to become the Lynx, an object that Tantaline could sell for profit. Every time I think about this, it just fills me with rage. There's a passage in chapter 10 that shows Inej's perspective of the dynamics of the menagerie. Each girl was known by her animal name: leopard, mare, fox, raven, ermine, fawn, snake. Suli seers wore the jackal mask when they plied their trade and looked into a person's fate. But what man would want to bet a jackal? So the Suli girl, and the menagerie always stalked a Suli girl, was known as the Lynx. Clients didn't come looking for the girls themselves. Just brown Suli skin, the fire of Kalish hair, the tilt of golden shoe eyes. The animals remained the same, though the girls came and went. Remember earlier when I talked about how the designs of playing cards were often dictated by the local elite? Well, the same applies to how the powerful write whatever identities they want to onto powerless people. Oppressed people have the most lies told about them and the strongest stereotypes perpetuated about them because they have the least amount of control about how they are depicted and perceived. Inej also describes how the people who come to West Stave, the district where the brothels are located, wear masks to hide their identities. The horns of the imp, the goggling eyes of the madman, the sad face of the scarab queen wrought in black and gold. Artists love to paint scenes of West Stave, the boys and girls who worked the brothels, the pleasure seekers dressed as characters of the comedy brute. But there was no beauty here, no real merriment or joy, just a transaction, people seeking escape or some colorful oblivion, some dream of decadence that they could wake from whenever they wished. These people can remove their masks, but the people enslaved by the brothels cannot. They are forced to wear the two-dimensional identities painted onto them, and are seen as less than human. Even now that she has a new identity, the Wraith, and a completely badass set of skills to go with it, Inej still has a panic attack when she walks by the menagerie and is confronted by Tante Helene. Being the Wraith has taught her to become more dangerous than the men who would abuse her, but it hasn't offered her any real healing, and being part of a gang doesn't fit with her beliefs. She doesn't want to hurt and blackmail people. If the heart is an arrow, then being the Wraith isn't a good enough thing to aim at, and nor, as she knows, is Kaz. Feeling anything for Kaz Brecker was the worst kind of foolishness. She knew that. But he'd been the one to rescue her, to see her potential. He'd bet on her, and that meant something, even if he'd done it for his own selfish reasons. He'd even dubbed her the Wraith. Watching Inej's struggle is one of the hardest parts of reading the book for me. But when she finds her purpose, it's more than worth the wait. The whole ice court heist depends on Inej being able to climb the incinerator shaft in the prison sector and attach a rope to the top so the rest can follow her. But the shaft is so hot that her shoes start to melt off, and she realizes part of the way up that she isn't going to make it. And she is so enraged that she let herself get into this situation. She'd trusted Kaz Brecker that night. She'd become the dangerous girl he'd sensed lurking inside her. But she'd made the mistake of continuing to trust him, of believing the legend he'd built around himself. That myth had brought her here to this sweltering darkness, balancing between life and death like the last leaf clinging to an autumn branch. In the end, Kaz Brecker was just a boy, and she'd let him lead her to this fate. She couldn't even blame him. She'd let herself be led because she hadn't known where she wanted to go. But then it starts to rain, and she starts to feel something different. But even as she gave thanks, she knew the rain was not enough. She wanted a storm, thunder, wind, a deluge. She wanted it to crash through Ketterdam's pleasure houses, lifting roofs and tearing doors off their hinges. She wanted it to raise the seas, take hold of every slaving ship, shatter their masts, and smash their hulls against unforgiving shores. I want to call that storm, she thought, and 4 million crew might be enough to do it. Enough for her own ship, something small and fierce and laden with firepower, something like her. She would hunt the slavers and their buyers. They would learn to fear her, and they would know her by her name. The heart is an arrow. It demands aim to land true. She clung to the wall, but it was purpose she grasped at long last, and that carried her upward. She was not a lynx, or a spider, or even the Wraith. She was Inej Gaffa, and her future was waiting above. That passage will never leave me. I did a lot of thinking on this second read about why this chapter means so much to me, and I think there are a lot of reasons. One is I think this is the most powerful moment I've ever seen a female character experience that had nothing to do with romance or self-sacrifice. So many of the female characters I grew up with only reached these heights of euphoria when they were finding their true love, and only felt this much purpose when they were deciding to give up everything, sometimes their literal lives, in order to save the day. But Inej succeeds here because she refuses to sacrifice herself and throws off every false identity that anyone, including her love interest, has ever tried to reduce her to. I also think it's so powerful because it's believable. When a character goes through something as horrible as she has, it's not satisfying if their problems are solved with the wave of a magic wand. But we don't want them to keep suffering either. Inej does have to hit rock bottom before realizing what she wants. But the path she discovers is one that can offer her real healing and vengeance. This is a way she can reconcile the girl who loves her family and believes in saints with the ruthless survivor who made it through the menagerie and life on the streets. We also get to see that her newfound purpose allows her to confront Helene without having a panic attack. And we get the added bonus of watching her strangle Helene and then totally dupe her into helping them all escape. It's also Inej who inspires the crows to come up with a new plan after Kaz's Pecorolans fetish sends the old plan tits up. She has the idea that she and Nina can sneak in with the menagerie delegation, knowing the Fjerdans won't see the menagerie girls as a threat. "You know those costumes," she said. "Heavy cloaks, hoods, that's all the Fjerdans will see. A Zemini fawn, a Kalish mare." She swallowed and forced the next words past her lips. "A Suli lynx." Not people, not even really girls. Just lovely objects to be collected. It's still not easy for her, but she's finally able to face her traumatic past. Kaz shows us the value of building a myth around yourself and of seeing through the myths of others. But Inej shows us that people sometimes have myths forced upon them, and how dehumanizing that can be. She also reminds us that our power comes from who we are as a whole, the good and the ugly, the weak and the strong. I love her so much. And that's part 1 of my 6 of Crows analysis. I hope it at least a little bit made sense. If I had takes you particularly liked or disagreed with, please leave a note in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if the Saints move you too, hit the like and subscribe button. You can also follow me on Instagram at happilyellaafter22. I do not have a Twitter because it seems like the shadow fold of the internet these days. In my next video, I'm going to wrap up the Crows by discussing Nina, Matthias, Jesper, Wylan, the Wheel of Fortune, propaganda, and daddy issues. I hope you'll join me.